I'm saying that I'll start off with the introduction about the webinar, the session itself, and then we will go straight to the panelists who will share with us different perspectives. So as we all know, the title of this webinar is Reviving Beijing's Neglected Macroeconomic Agenda for Tax Justice for Women's Rights. And the event is because the CSW was cancelled. And so we have decided to have a virtual session for this. And the organizations that are co-sponsoring the event include Womankind, Bretton Woods Project, Center for Economic and Social Rights, the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, DAWN, which is Development Alternatives for Women for a New Era, Tax Justice Network, Wide Austria, Public Services International, Tax Justice Network Africa, Garden, which is Gender and Development Network, Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, Christian Aid, Action Aid, Society for International Development, and Oxfam Novib. So we are very grateful for these organizations coming together to put this event, which aims to address the actions and strategic objectives that are highlighted in the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action to promote women's economic rights. And of course, the session will focus on taxation and illicit financial flows. And also acknowledging the challenges in realizing women's economic rights, especially in the context of shrinking democratic space. It will offer perspectives in addressing some of these challenges moving forward. And so speakers during this session will highlight progress and setbacks in feminist tax policies and provide concrete actions to advance progressive tax regimes and financing models that support the full implementation of women's human rights in accordance, of course, with the Beijing Platform for Declaration, Platform of Action. Just to note that the video is, the session is being recorded. I hope no one has any reservations around that. And also that the presentations will be shared afterwards, after the session comes to an end. With me as a co-moderator and also a co-chair of this session is Rose Saalbrink. Rose Saalbrink is the Policy and Advocacy Manager on Women's Economic Rights at Womankind Worldwide, and also a co-coordinator of the GATJ Tax and Gender Working Group that has graciously put together the session. And myself, Caroline Othim, the Global Policy and Campaigns Coordinator, Africa. And so at this point, I would like to open the floor. And I'd also suggest that you all mute your speakers if you are not speaking. At this point, I will invite our first panelist, who is Dr. Marianna Leite, the Global Lead on Gender and Inequality from Christian Aid. So Marianna works on the development of holistic approaches to gender and intersecting inequalities that ensure equality of outcomes and rights for all. Now, Marianna will get to share with us some of the UN legal frameworks that talk about women human rights, and of course, in the context of the Beijing Platform for Action. Marianna, let me hand the microphone over to you now.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now? I think I was muted for a bit.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. I was just saying that it's great to be with you, and I'm glad that we still could have the panel, even though we couldn't have it in person. And just thanking Carol and Rose for organizing, as well as the rest of the organizing team for putting this together. I've shared my screen, so if you have any issues seeing the presentation, please do let me know. I cannot see the box as I'm presenting, but uh, uh, just unmute and let me know, and I'll try to figure out if there are any technical issues. As Carol mentioned, I'm going to talk about the human rights lens to economic justice, and others will complement with the more specific aspects in terms of illicit financial flows and how that connects to other processes such as financing for development. And obviously to the point of fiscal justice. And so I won't go into that detail. So just so you know, I wanted to make sure that we went through key human rights instruments. So as you can see on the chart on the screen, there are several human rights instruments at global and regional level that can be used to leverage the work we do on fiscal justice. Unjust fiscal policies are responsible for human rights violations. I think that's that's our departure point. And we should, and if when relevant, we should use those human rights instruments to put our claims and to push for our particular asks at national, regional, and global level. I will mention every single document. There are several apart from the ones that are on the screen, but I will try to mention the ones that are most relevant or that have been more widely used and therefore might be more useful to this group. Human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals are interlinked. So if we look at the SDGs or Agenda 2030 from a holistic perspective, we will then approach it as an interconnected and interdependent agenda. However, even the SDGs as they come as a renewal, at least in my opinion, of those human rights commitments, they are still not enough to make sure that the previously enshrined human rights are enjoyed by everyone, because we have a very strong, as we might know on this call, a very strong economic system in liberal policies that undermine our ability to make sure that the goals and human rights commitments are respected. So for example, 120 million around the world are undernourished, and 2 billion people are in moderate or severe food insecurity, and that's a direct violation of the right to food, which is a violation of Article 11 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and also goes against or undermines the implementation of SDG Indicator 2.1.1, which tackles the prevalence of undernourishment and moderate and severe food insecurity. The same can be observed when we look at health. So 2,000 million people lack access to essential medicine. At least half of the world's population do not have full coverage of essential health services. And when we look at particular regions such as sub-Saharan Africa, we see extremely high rates of maternal mortality. For example, 920 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births, which is in direct violation of the right to health and the right to life. And that violates Article 12 of the Economic and Social Rights Covenant. And another example is Article 12 of the Convention on Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and also undermines the implementation or the realization of this SDG 3.1, 3.8, and 3.1, 3.1 on maternal mortality and 3.8 on universal health coverage. And just as a last example, but we could go on and on, unfortunately, to other spheres of life. 844 million people do not have access to basic drinking water, while 2.1 billion lacks access to safe, readily available water at home. And that's a direct violation of the right to water and sanitation, as well as the right to life, which undermines SDG 6.1. Focusing on universal and equitable access to safe water and sanitation for all, and also SDG 6.2, access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene. So it's a big challenge, and so the real question is, how can we tackle that challenge and using human rights as a tool? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights establishes in Article 22 that everyone has the right to everyone has economic, social, and cultural rights, and they are indispensable for everyone's dignity and free development. That is, say, the main, or the Bill of Rights that then inform the rest of the human rights instruments. And as I mentioned briefly before, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is, complements the one on political and civil rights, it's quite strongly establishes the right to economic, social, and cultural development on Article 1. And on Article 2, it creates the obligation to make sure that there is the disposal of maximum available resources by states, and that should be done without discrimination of any kind. When we look at the CEDAW Convention, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, we see a complementation of those previously mentioned instruments, particularly looking at discrimination. Article 2D of the CEDAW Convention states that all state parties must refrain from engaging in any act of practice of discrimination and ensure that public authorities and institutions commit and act in conformity with this obligation. The CEDAW Committee, which is the UN committee responsible for the oversight of the implementation of the CEDAW Convention, issues general recommendations, which, although are not legally binding as a convention, have a very important political pull. General Recommendation 24 establishes that the right to health requires budgetary measures for the fulfillment of economic, social, and cultural rights, which include addressing tax abuses as part of their obligation to respect economic, social, and cultural rights. The same, sort of along the same veins, we have General Recommendation 35, Article 14, which looks at what I find particularly useful is this concept of gender-based violence in a broad spectrum. So it affirms that gender-based violence can take multiple forms, such as economic harm, and is exacerbated by cultural, economic, ideological, technical, political, and religious, and social environmental factors, and increased by globalization of economic activities, including global supply chains, extractive and offshoring industry, and is also affected by political, economic, and social crisis. So as you can see, there's the definition goes beyond just what we would automatically associate as gender-based violence. So it's not only physical harm, it looks at other aspects such as mental harm, but also beyond, looking at structural violence. So what are the superstructures or the root causes of the symptoms we're trying to tackle when we're looking at gender-based violence. The Beijing Declaration Platform for Action, which Carol already mentioned, is a cornerstone for women's rights. It was agreed upon in 1995, which was what we were we are celebrating this year, and we were going to celebrate during CSW 64. The Platform for Action has strategic objectives, and as a human rights instrument is supposed to be abided by states. And a strategic objective I.2 states, for example, that there should be equality and non-discrimination under the law and in practice. G.1 affirms that we should strive to women's equal access to food, participation in power structures and decision making. G.2 focuses on women's capacity to participation in decision making and leadership. I.1 focuses on the implementation of human rights of women, and focusing particularly on the CEDAW Convention. And 8.1 and 8.2, which I think is more focused on the discussions that we're having today, focus on the macroeconomic policy. So 8.1 focuses on development of strategies that address the needs and efforts of women, which link to macroeconomic policies. And 8.2 focuses on the revision of laws and administrative practices that ensure women have equal rights and access to economic resources. There are other norms that we can use when we're talking about economic rights. They're binding and non-binding proposals. There is one set of non-binding rules, which are not a proposal, they actually have come to fruition, are the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and they are oriented by 3 pillars, which is the state's duty to protect human rights, corporations' responsibility to respect human rights, and victims' right to access effective remedy. The UNGPs are in constant flux. So when they were created by John Ruggie, they did not have a gender dimension, sort of a robust gender dimension to them. And that was just addressed last year through the creation of the gender guidance on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which you can see on the screen. The guidance is also non-binding, but it can be used to have a more comprehensive interpretation of the other human rights norms that I've mentioned before, and I'll mention in short when we're talking about the regional level.
Marianna, your time is almost up. I'd appreciate if you could wind up the presentation. Thank you.
Sure, I'll be brief. There is also a call for a binding treaty on business and human rights, which is still under discussion. There are other relevant guidance, such as the Maastricht Principles on the extraterritorial obligations of states in the area of economic, social rights. And there are also recommendations, such as the Committee on the Convention of the Rights of the Child, that looks at how tax evasion might violate human rights. As I mentioned, there are several regional bodies. I won't go into detail, but I just wanted to show that chart so you can see that they actually complement other aspects of the global bodies that are often thematic. In Europe, there is no clear protection of economic rights. In Africa, there is the recognition of the right to economic development and principles that push for sufficient resources for the implementation of human rights, including taxation. And in the Americas, we have the recognition that states must adopt measures, both internally and through international cooperation, especially those of an economic and technical nature, to make sure that human rights are respected and enjoyed. And then in Asia, there is no binding instrument, but there is a People's Human Rights Charter, which recognizes that the political and economic systems have to operate within a framework of human rights. So there is, again, a wider dimension beyond just fiscal justice, which is the push for a human rights-centered economic model. So I'll stop there. I think there are also, the very last slide was the element on national level. So there are laws at national level, such as in France, which is looking at the duty of vigilance, imposing the obligation of doing due diligence on to prevent serious human rights abuses. And there have been attempts, such as in Brazil, which has been criticized, but nevertheless is there, to internalize the UNGPs, so the voluntary principles on business and human rights. I'm happy to discuss that further during our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianna, for that wonderful presentation. We will open up the floor at some time later on after all the panelists have given their perspectives. And so if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, or you can note them down and share that later on. Next to speak is Veronica Montufar. Veronica is the Gender and Equality Officer at Public Services International. She's a sociologist and a political scientist as well. She will represent the trade union movement in this conversation and will help us really get a link between tax, gender, and public service provision, and also perhaps talk about how to redistribute unpaid care work and the role of unions in this conversation. Veronica, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Carol, and hi, everyone. I will try to share my presentation here. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, for Public Services International, as a global trade union, we have a long way working on tax justice issues, but only since 2017, we have a specific dimension of gender, of putting the perspective of gender on our tax work. As you can see, our World Congress in that year proposed us that we need to advocate for international and national tax systems that reduce gender gaps, and also to develop and promote gender-responsive quality public services and their role in creating gender justice and sustainable development. So these two international decisions worldwide guide since that year our work linking tax justice, gender justice, and our work of promoting and developing gender-responsive public services. For this moment, what we have done is try to build in a momentum at the national and international arena. And our joint work with the tax justice movement has built on evidence. And we have tried to put in the debate our criticism for financing public services and how this can really integrate a full enjoyment of women and girls' human rights. For this, our first actions were to carry out two studies, one in Peru and the second in Ghana, that show the holes that public services have, because there are specific situations that drain the capacity and investment in programs of states. Especially in Peru, what we saw is that the Peruvian government, they have increased their public budget for financing public services. But this financing of public services didn't have a gender perspective, a transformative gender perspective. So what we saw that there is that even though there were a great amount of tax elusion, of tax evasion, even though that, the Peruvian government have the capacity to have more budget for investment in public services. But this investment was not in the lens of transformative gender issues. What they were doing is like perpetuating gender roles, perpetuating gender inequalities. So from there, our decision was that seeing that 2020 is a critical year for gender equality and women's rights agenda, what we decide is to gain more space for tax justice and its linkages with gender justice in the narrative of public services defense. And we need to build a scenario in 2020 for key discussions. One of these international scenario was the UN CSW 64. As everyone knows, this international meeting changed of format because of the CV-19. And the global unions coalitions that we act in the CSW and in most of the UN arena as a global union group, we set up a response in which I want to share with you, especially two things that this response has. At first, we are saying that we really neglect what the political declaration has. And the political declaration is a declaration that do not have any ambition, and not having any ambition of transforming women's and girls' rights and really working for equality. What we have seen here is that what they are doing is opening the space of private sector for trying to legitimize this private sector as actors of gender equality. So for us, this is not possible. What we are saying is that what they are putting there, especially opening the door of public-private partnerships, is not the way of really doing gender justice. And what we are saying is that we reclaim the responsibility, the main responsibility of states of having the property and the delivering public services for women, but not only delivering public services for women, but these have to be in an approach of delivering quality and gender responsive public services. As well, the Global Union's response have a specific paragraph on taxes where we are asking why the governments are not stating clearly that financing for gender development, financing for gender equality means and needs to have a really progressive tax system, international and nationally. So having this, what we are seeing now is the the equality generation forums, the generation equality forums. As you know, we have in Mexico and Paris two meetings. We don't know what is going to happen there, but what we are planning is to be there and to try to put this also in the agenda of the civil society for discussion. And by the end, in 2020, what we are expecting is to also be in the United Nations General Assembly. For that, what we have prepared and how we are preparing ourselves for the Beijing Plus 25 process, what we are preparing is first a parallel report on Peru. Unfortunately, we have only this version in Spanish, but I think that this parallel report, it has to be really important, and maybe we need to put this debate more on the international arena and the social movement arena. What the Peru parallel report in Peru is saying is that the official report of the Peruvian government don't have any data from regarding the financing sources for gender equality, that the Peruvian formal report do not have any data on taxes and how taxes policies are impacting women's lives, impacted negatively or positively. And also what we are saying there is that the taxes exemptions are huge, and those resources could be investments in quality and gender responsive public services. On the way, we are trying to put together, and I hope that we will have this soon, a parallel report also in Brazil, about Brazil. And for by the end, what we want to do is a new comparative study on the evidence given by the studies in Peru, in Chile, and Brazil, and trying to build a proposal for gender and tax justice, focusing in gender responsive quality public services. What we want to do is that maybe this alternative proposal could be at first debate, discuss in Mexico, if there is a possibility to organize there a meeting, try to put the same in Paris, and try to do international online and maybe there in New York action, trying to present this alternative proposal for tax justice for financing gender justice. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Veronica, for that wonderful perspective from the Global Union, and also the examples from the Latin America region, Peru. So next we will have Cynthia Umurungi to speak about IFF within the African context, and more broadly how that impacts on gender equality. So Cynthia is involved in articulating the tax justice agenda to different constituencies in the Africa region. She's responsible for communicating TJNA's position on various tax issues through the media and in different advocacy spaces, as she is the Communications and Outreach Officer at Tax Justice Network Africa. Cynthia, I'll hand over the mic to you now. You have 10 minutes for your presentation. Kindly keep time, because we are cognizant that we may run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I will keep time, promise. So I am going to speak about IFFs. Please do let me know when you see my screen. I have started sharing.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'll speak generally about IFFs, because what we are saying is that developing countries do have the money or should have the money to finance women's rights, but that money is not within countries because of the illicit financial flows. So I'll go directly to the presentation. Basically, the illicit financial flows are defined as money illegally earned or transferred or used. And this is the definition that was given by the high-level panel on IFFs. And they are categorized in, they can be found in 3 categories, that is commercial, criminal, or corruption. Commercial can have things like tax avoidance, and criminal could be laundering of dirty money, and corruption is the kickbacks that are given to politicians, maybe to set up some sort of the PPPs. So it's things like that. As you may see on this graphic, it clearly says that for every $1 that a developing country gets, it loses $2. It's pretty self-explanatory, actually. It actually shows that for the money that is lost, a big chunk of it is because of IFFs. And why are we talking about illicit financial flows in this kind of forum? It is mainly because women suffer the cost of IFFs, and as a result of IFFs, they do bear the burden of tax, of debt repayment, tax incentives, the austerity measures, and budget deficit generated through indirect taxes. I will speak again on indirect taxes later. And WIDA actually reported that lost tax revenue due to corporate avoidance is between 50 to 100 billion US dollars every year. But interestingly, the high-level panel on illicit financial flows also said that Africa alone loses about 50 billion. And this might not be the right figure, considering that some countries have some level of secrecy that they wouldn't even allow the research to be completed with precision. So this money could be more than we actually think. The next thing I want to talk about is the inadequate funding of public services due to IFFs. Women suffer the cost of IFFs, but before we go there, I would like to first talk about the promises that were made to women and girls. I think Dr. Marianna talked about them, about the political declarations and the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. For example, there is investing in education, training, science. There is strengthening and reposition gender machineries in all spheres of life. There is scaling up social protection, and there is participation of women and girls in productive sector, as well as elimination of all forms of discrimination and violence against women. So despite all these commitments, security, justice, basic social service, such as health, education, sanitation, housing, water, piped water in people's environment or households, all that is still underfunded. And there is a form of regressive taxation that is quite getting very normal or normalized in developing countries. For example, I would like to mention the research that was done thanks to a tool called the Fair Tax Monitor. It's a tool that was developed in collaboration by TJNA in collaboration with Oxfam. The research was done in Uganda, Nigeria, Senegal, Malawi, Zambia, Cameroon, Tunisia. As you may see, more research is coming in few coming months. We saw that the indirect tax is actually way more than the direct tax in terms of country revenues. So indirect tax is definitely a very aggressive form of taxation. And it affects everyone, but mainly women, because of the purchasing power that is obviously low. And it was also reported that actually when women when these tax are attached to household items, it becomes more difficult for women because they tend to buy more of the household items like food. The second thing I want to mention is that there is a Femnet report on the gender and IFFs. It actually talks about the girls who are out of school. It's 36% versus 31% of girls who are out of school. And the reason that they give is the poor infrastructure, for example, that makes it difficult for girls who have attained puberty if there is no water or privacy or toilets that are on the side. There is the high rate of pregnancy and early marriage. There is also the executive director of the UN Women in 2015. It's not that old to change the numbers drastically. They said that 2/3 of African women are classified as functionally illiterate. On health specifically, for example, many developing countries tend to ask women to pay out of their pockets. There are some services by the government that somehow subsidize some health services, but the thing is, some of those services do not include, for example, reproduction health, at least for adolescents. When they do, they talk about the cost maybe of giving birth or following up on pregnant women, but the health of young girls and older women is not considered. There is limited access to healthcare and due to, of course, poor capacity to pay. And because of that, the causes of death in sub-Saharan Africa is the communicable diseases. And women tend to be exposed to those diseases because they are the ones who take care of sick people. So they get contaminated faster. There is the unmet need for family planning, unsafe abortions, and still high levels of maternal mortality. Poor public services and unpaid care work. So when there is a high level of IFFs, the countries are not able to get the money that they are supposed to get to finance various public services. And women tend to compensate and do the work that will help the economy to advance. But that labor is not counted in the labor force surveys, and it's not even part of the calculations of the GDP. It contributes to 10 to 39% of the GDP, depending on countries. And it was valued by the Oxfam in their report Time to Share at 11 trillion USD per year globally. Example is, for example, in Uganda, women spend 18% more time in caregiving than men, and they spend 17% less time in productive activities. And yet the commitments show that women should be participating more in the economical activities and in activities that are productive and give them an income. Women spend a total of, yes?
You should be winding up now, okay?
All right, women spend a total of 16 million hours fetching water, which gives them a problem with their health, the back, the knees, and all that. So I will not go through this so much because it's obvious, you can read about it. I'd like to talk about this Zambian case, for example, where Zambia lost 17 million and yet it spends about 9% on health. And the money that was lost could easily put a child in school every 12 minutes. So here are our asks. We want the IFFs to not be the issue of African countries, of developing countries. So there must be a UN intergovernmental tax body which should ensure equal participation of everyone. Also, our asks are maximize resources to fund gender equality, progressive taxation, gender responsive budgeting, and stop all forms of IFFs. Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thank you, Cynthia, for that wonderful presentation, giving us the perspective and what is foregone through illicit financial flows and some of the work that you are doing at Tax Justice Network through the Fair Tax Monitor. Next is Juliet Nakato. Juliet is the Director of Programs at Forum for Women in Democracy based in Uganda. She is a feminist who is committed to uplifting women and girls to their potential and do all that they can be doing to transform and impact their communities. Juliet will speak about their gender responsive budgeting work and village clubs, social accountability experience. Juliet, you have 10 minutes. Please, I hope you'll keep time. Thank you.
Okay, so sorry, I think it's, you can see it now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm really happy to be here, and I'd really like to share FOWODE's experience with gender-based budgeting work in Uganda. I think Cynthia's presentation sets and the presentations that came before set a very good foundation for us to share examples. And very quickly, I'd like to just share this quote from Charles de Gaulle, which says, "Politics is too serious a matter to be left to politicians." And here at FOWODE, we believe that economics is too serious a matter to be left only to economists. And that, to a large extent, guides and drives our work. Our mission is to promote gender equality in all areas of decision making. And we advocate for inclusive and just governance to ensure that women's voice, that give women voice, choice, and power. We also nurture alternative and transformative leadership, especially focusing on young women, and we also advocate against unequal power structures, lobbying for public resources to be equitably shared between women and men. What's our premise as an organization for our gender budget work? We believe that all budgets are about politics, and all politics is ultimately about who controls budgets. Women, like men, have the right to equal access to public services, and budgets really matter to women because, as Cynthia said, they support their rights to health, education, and a better lives. Poor women, more than men, rely on public services because they don't often have other options. So if we have situations where people have to pay for health and education, girls and women from poorer households tend to be the losers because when priorities are made, girls and women tend to be the last priority. And so public services really matter, and gender budgeting is really important for women and girls. So FOWODE's gender responsive budget work dates back to 1998. Our government prefers to call it gender and equity budgeting. We do not mind the change in nomenclature as long as we see benefits for women and girls. So how did we start? Years of research and advocacy culminated into the enactment of the Public Finance Management Act of 2015. And so anybody doing gender budget work, from FOWODE's experience, you'll understand that it takes work, it takes time, but we see a light at the end of the tunnel because at least we have a law in place that requires government ministries, departments, and agencies to implement gender and equity budgeting with the Equal Opportunity Commission ensuring compliance. why do we feel that, why gender responsive budgeting? We undertake gender responsive budgeting to raise citizens' awareness on gender and impacts that budgets and policies have on women and men, to also change budgets and policies to promote gender equality, and to make governments accountable for gender equality through budgetary commitments. I just wanted to show in pictures why we need gender responsive budgeting. If our taxes went into improving health services, this is a picture of Mulago Hospital. And I think you can see the situation. This is the maternity section. This is what mothers have to go through, why gender budgeting is important. To undertake gender responsive budgeting, there are several actions that we take. We develop capacity of technocrats, legislators, CSOs, village budget clubs. Those are community groups in gender and other aspects, and general economic terminologies and issues. Then we also undertake gender budget research. We do analysis of national budgets, public expenditure tracking surveys, gender audits of specific sectors, say education, health, and also position papers on budget speeches. We also offer hands-on support on gender responsive budgeting and support local governments to make gender-aware budget plans, and also provide guidebooks so that even when, say, new officers come on board, they are able to get some guidance through the materials that are shared. And of course, we also undertake advocacy through strategic meetings with parliamentarians, councillors at local levels, and working with other organizations like the civil society budget advocacy group. And also working with the people we call gender responsive budget champions in different spaces. For example, you have champions in parliament and also at the local government level. I'll just quickly share what we call the village budget club model, a social accountability model where local people at the grassroots, citizens at the local level hold their leaders accountable through scrutiny of services and budgets. This was started in 2009, and it seeks to promote gender accountability by enhancing the capacities of local communities to hold local governments accountable for gender responsive service delivery. Through these village budget clubs, which we call the VBCs, communities engage in planning, budgeting, and monitoring government programs to benefit women, men, girls, and boys. Very quickly, I'll not go through all the steps. This is the VBC model in short, and it has 5 key aspects. We have the training of the community members, then we have monitoring or inspecting of service delivery points, say health centers, schools, or any other sector that the community may decide. After the monitoring of the sectors, community dialogues are held where the members discuss what they found from visiting the schools, health center, or the services that they decided to monitor. And they have they have very lively and heated discussions where they build consensus on the key issues, because there can be a list of 10 or 20 things that people have observed as problems at the hospital, in the schools, but the community is guided by the village budget club members to prioritize. After this, they meet with the duty bearers and present their priorities and concerns, which are normally acted upon. And we've really seen quite a bit of success in this model. We also work with the media to amplify the issues and the voices of the citizens.
Juliet, could you please wind up? Just wind up your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, I will wind up. So what we are doing is we are also having the village budget clubs play a greater role in terms of understanding taxation and the links that the taxes have to the services that are being delivered. Because we know that taxation has the potential, if not equitably implemented, to compound the inequalities that are being faced by women and men. I'll not dwell so much on this, but I thought I'd share this picture which highlighted the fact that a lot of the consumption taxation, there's more, the consumption taxes are much higher than any of the other, say like the corporate taxes, which really impact on women. And this has been something that has been observed. This is just a quick example of a success story of the work that the village budget clubs did on taxation, where in 2018-2019, government had proposed a 30% income tax on savings and credit cooperatives organizations, who we call SACCOs. And the village budget clubs lobbied they worked with communities, sensitized them, and this proposal was dropped. Also, another tax that was introduced was on the mobile money tax, which after advocacy of different groups, many of the village budget clubs were engaged and talked to their members of parliament, their local leaders, and government reduced the tax. And so really these are just some of the things that are happening on the social accountability front, and just to highlight the things, how communities can be engaged in this discussion around taxation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliet, for sharing with us those perspectives from FOWODE and the work that you're doing. At this point, I'll want to invite Bilquis Tahira from Shirakat, Pakistan, to share with us her experiences working on macroeconomic framework and some of the IMF conditionalities and their impact on women and their work on CEDAW as well, in brief. So Bilquis, you have 8 minutes, and then I'll hand it over to Roosje to handle the next session on the Q&A. Bilquis, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on wherever you are. And thank you very much for having this space. I would try to quickly share my slides. And okay, so I have to go up. Just a minute. Oh, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm trying to put it into slideshow.
It's at the right bottom, next to the plus and minus sign, or that one that you're hovering. Yes, that's it too.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to do that.
From the beginning, yes. I think that should work.
Set up slideshow, no.
No, kindly click from the beginning. Just close that on the top right side, left side, sorry, from the beginning.
Left side from beginning. Oh,
yeah.
okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Shirakat, Partnership for Development in Pakistan, is a women's human rights group which has been working on looking at, impact of IMF policies on women's lives in Pakistan for some time now, doing gender budget analysis and, looking at how the government policies, financial policies, economic policies impact on women. So because I have little time, and because IMF keeps saying that they are not accountable to human rights obligations or CEDAW, and they keep saying this is not their mandate, it's World Bank mandate. So these are just a few reasons why IMF should be held accountable. It was set up as a specialized UN agency like UNESCO, FAO, ILO, and IOM. And although it's autonomous, it works through with the UN through ECOSOC and other bodies. It has been incorporated into the United Nations system by ECOSOC, and thus it has to conform to all international human rights and women's rights obligations. And UN High-Level Panel on Women's Economic Empowerment actually said macroeconomic policies are crucial enablers of gender equality because they shape the overall economic environment for women's economic empowerment. And then CEDAW recognized that in situations of poverty, women have the least access to food, health, education, training and opportunities, employment and other needs. So Pakistan has had a very long history with IMF. There have been 22 loans since 1958. And with each loan, there have been either structural adjustment conditionalities or other policy conditions, which then means because Pakistan is dependent on IMF loans and other international finance institutions, that on decision making, there's a strong influence of these, bodies. Loans have been based mainly on fiscal consolidation, which means government policies that are intended to reduce deficits and the accumulation of debt, austerity, privatization, and deregulation of workers' protection. Then they have resulted in enhanced regressive taxation as against progressive taxation, where you tax the rich, placing the heaviest burden on the poor. But the whole situation really affects women disproportionately. And actually, the structural adjustment programs or poverty reduction and growth facility, whatever it's called, has actually, in fact, foreclosed the possibility of any significant reduction in poverty, which all of these loans have promised over time. So what is the current situation? The latest loan program, which was signed in August 2019, also is based on decisive fiscal consolidation. And there have been conditionalities put in to cut subsidies and increase taxes. And as a result, the general sales tax has been increased on all household consumption items, for example, toothpaste and poultry. The tax on edible oil, and everyone has to pay that, whether you're poor or rich, has been increased by over 6%. So that means that the purchasing power of consumption baskets by women has increased. And I don't really have to explain it, how it then imposes heavier burdens of domestic and care work on women. Increase in petrol prices, about 4 months ago, it was 8%, but then it was increased further, impacts women's ability to travel, which means limited access to health, limited access to education, since women are the ones who are dependent on public transport for their mobility. And in Pakistan also, because most of the times women have to be chaperoned, it means not travel for one person, but more than one. Then electricity tariffs have been increased due to subsidy cuts and privatization, which has had again, and on water as well. So the bills we get today are almost twice the size of what we had, about a year ago. All of this means that a lot of people, household costs have gone up, and a number of people have actually slid down the line of poverty. And many women have been pushed into informal labor just to put food on the table. Poverty has increased, and time spent on unpaid care work, such as fuel collection and others, has been increased. And the national poverty ratio has been projected to increase from 31.3% to 40% by June 2020, which means that 19 million more people will be living in poverty after the next 3 months. The severe cuts in development. So what has this meant for development budget and development financing? There have been severe cuts in development and social sector spending at the provincial level as well, because due to the devolution of power at the provincial level, the federal government has moved some of this burden to the provinces who have no other option but to cut their development and social sector spending. It has also meant that job creation in public sector has been halted, which is which was a space where women could get equal wages for equal work, and already they are less engaged in numbers in public sector jobs. Spending on social services has reduced, so I can, really empathize and, link it with the previous presentation where, you saw the hospitals, heavy burden on the hospitals and other social spending. Similarly, the government keeps saying that they have increased social sector programs and social protection spending. And actually, there are many other social protection schemes that have been announced, but because the testing method that they are using is the World Bank developed poverty scorecard, actually leaves a large number of people behind. It has also meant that because people, and particularly workers, are so busy putting food on the table, that there has been a regular decline in union membership, and ever more limited collective bargaining mechanisms. The programs that are in place entirely neglect workers' empowerment and the need to develop decent work agenda. So what are our advocacy asks? We want the development world to replace the flawed and failed macroeconomic framework with a feminist macroeconomic framework. And we have offered IMF that we could, help them. And so would a number of other networks and organizations to provide technical support to them if they're willing to do that, though they are not willing at the moment. Gender assessment should be a must of all loan programs. A state must explore alternatives through IMF and World Bank loans to find fiscal space, preventing illicit financial flows. And you must hear a lot about that in the news now. It should be a priority. The state should renegotiate loan repayments and see how the fiscal space that becomes available through that can be used for social services and social development financing. So the next one is linked to the above: increased development financing and social spending. Review and replace social protection mechanisms of targeting with women-friendly mechanisms. So at the national level, our advocacy has been with parliamentarians, with the state, On the CSO side, because there are a limited number of organizations that are monitoring this, and there's a gap of linkage between social development, CSOs working on social development, and economic development agenda, because everybody feels that, you know, macroeconomics is a mystery, and, you know, it's difficult to demystify it. So we have been working on capacity development of national CSOs around that. We have had a dialogue with IMF Pakistan and have had, you know, several meetings with them. There has been an expert group meeting also. There's very limited research, so we are trying to find ways of having, you know, proper, accurate data available on that. We have undertaken a national consultation as well. We went on TV for 8 March and demanded that and in the same panel, there were some state politicians as well. At the international, at the global level, we submitted a report to a CEDAW committee ahead of Pakistan review, which included all of these advocacy asks and also summarized the situation for CEDAW committee to understand. We have included the same asks that I mentioned previously in the oral statement made to CEDAW committee. Then we had these soft reminders during lunch briefing as well. Our general impression is that CEDAW committee also at the moment does not make these very direct connections of feminization of poverty, regressive, you know, taxation, and the impact of these, you know, loans and the fiscal space that is where that becomes limited due to illicit financial flows to women's economic rights. So we, you know, then submitted questions to CEDAW committee as well, and the committee actually, we were very lucky. The committee actually took the matter up with the state. However, the sad part of it is that this work did not make into the concluding observation. So what we want to do is, okay, continue our engagement with the CEDAW committee and also at the national level. That was the end of the slide presentation. Thank you very much. We are willing to answer questions during the...
Thank you very much. And so for the question and answer session, I'll invite my colleague Rose to lead the session. Rose, are you there? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Yes, thank you. I just want to extend my thanks to all the panelists and for everyone joining us from all around the world at some very unsavory times. And also extend my thanks to Tax Justice Network Africa in hosting us from Nairobi with less than 1 week's notice on this webinar. And I'd say from my end, everything seems very smooth. So thank you so much. We will, with the help of Brian from Tax Justice Network, be able to let people speak with their own voice if you are connected. So I will try and do that. That might not be the case for everyone, but I've also copied across some of those questions. I wanted to start with inviting Elfrida Tamba, if she is on the call. If she is a member of the United Nations Committee for Tax Experts on International Cooperation on Tax Matters. And I think we would all love to hear some of your thoughts on the current presentation. I don't know if you're able to join us and share some of our thoughts with us.
Elfrida, you can go ahead now.
We're not 100% sure if this works, but
she's on mute, so she can go ahead.
Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't get that, the last question.
No, I was inviting Elfrida Tamba to speak, but I'm not sure if she's still here. I don't see her at the moment, so I think we'll move on to questions that were raised before. I want to start with the question from Liz Kunha. I don't know if you can speak for yourself.
I've unmuted.
Liz, your question to Marianna.
Yes, hi. Can you hear
Hi.
me? Okay.
And if everyone can just state your name and your organization, that would be helpful.
Sure. It's Liz from GATJ International. I'm based in Brussels. I just had a question that goes all the way back to Marianna's presentation on all the human rights instruments and whether Marianna has considered arguing that regressive tax policies violate the principle of non-discrimination under international human rights law because it could be seen as indirect discrimination. I mean, it's a neutral policy that has disproportionate impacts to certain groups. I'm just curious to hear if that approach has been considered just because of previous academic research I did in the past. Thanks.
Thank you. I hope you could hear that, Marianna. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I haven't looked at regressive tax policies in relation to indirect discrimination per se, but I would be interested in looking at that and possibly with this group. Maybe that could be a good idea for a webinar. If you're interested in sharing more about your research, that'd be of interest to me. But as I said, when I was talking about the CEDA committee general recommendations and also the committee on the rights of the child the recommendations, we could construe that sort of possibly that could be construed as a human rights violations, but yeah, I'd like to explore that. And I just wanted to mention as well, I think there are a lot of studies that have been done by organizations that are represented in this call, such as the Center for Economic and Social Rights, that have been doing some of this analysis. So I would very much encourage people that are interested in this in looking those up. I certainly have benefited from looking at them. And I think beyond just the obligations themselves, there are also the principles. I mentioned some of them during my presentation. So there's the obligation to adopt measures to guarantee the enjoyment of social, cultural, and economic rights, the maximum available resources, which was mentioned, the minimum obligations by states, make sure that the rights, the human rights as enshrined in the international instruments are respected. Non-discrimination, which was also mentioned, is particularly relevant to see the disposal availability and effectiveness and quality of services. Progressive realization, which also means non-regression. So not only states have to progressively move towards the full realization of rights, but they cannot roll back, which is very relevant, particularly when we're talking about Beijing plus 25 and fundamentalists, and not only religious, but also economic and political. And lastly, participation and transparency. So particularly looking at women and girls from an intersection lens, those are most marginalized, particularly in the global South. So I'll leave it at that, but happy to answer other questions here or afterwards. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Marianna. I've heard that wasn't that clear to hear the questions, so I will read out the question, but then if the person would like to speak, we can try that. So the next questions were for Veronica. Anam asked if you could elaborate on the Peruvian example and what the policies were that were considered gender exploitative. And Leite asked also for Veronica if you could share with us some key findings of PSI's analysis regarding Peru's progress on the Beijing plus 25 agenda. And I appreciate that you might not be able to answer these right now, but Veronica, if you were able to respond to that as much as you could right now, that would be fantastic.
Yes, thank you. Our two reports on Peru, the one that we did in 2017 and the one that we did in 2019, are very linked. In 2017, we studied 34 public services in Peru, and we study all the tax elusion, evasion, in which I already said that we don't have much information about that. But what we study is that the Peruvian government really have an increasement of investment, of public investment in some public services. For example, in the healthcare service. In the healthcare service, the policy of investment of the Peruvian government was to invest, to put up the chirurgical birth. Chirurgical birth was the amount of chirurgical birth grow. And we also see there that the teenager pregnancies also grow. And what we said is that if the investment of the Peruvian government went to chirurgical birth and not to prevent teenager pregnancy, there is a misunderstood of what gender equality is. So we saw that especially in the rural sector, teenager pregnancy growed a lot. And then we link this issue with all these ideological struggle that some regressive sectors did, especially in Peru, regarding all this criticism about the gender ideology. So the state investment was also influenced with this kind of regressive statements and regressive ideologies. So that was our first thing. Then for the parallel report, what we did is say, yes, the Peruvian government is reporting that they have invested a lot in gender equality, that they have reinforced some services, especially the healthcare services. So we are putting another time in this parallel report, these observations that the investments are investments that do not promote gender transformative policies, that the investment is only promoting gender policies that maybe the only thing that they do is to keep the situation of inequality of women and girls. And as I already said, our parallel report also states the issue that the report do not mention anything about the financiation of these gender equality policies. The report do not mention anything about the taxes and how taxes impact women or not impact women. And also that they do not see how tax incentives are put there, and this is draining the capacity of the states of really investing in gender equality. So I think that what we did in our reports is to put in that debate that the investment, even though it's not sufficient, the investment that the governments are doing, especially the Peruvian one, do not change gender equality. What they are doing is perpetuate inequality.
Thank you so much. That's a very clear answer there. I want to go to a question for Cynthia. Would you be able to expose some examples of public service policies that have worked in favor of gender equality in relation to IFFs?
Thank you very much, Rose. So for example, I'll talk about the number, just examples that come off head like that when we want to promote women in decision-making space. Like for example, in Rwanda, the number of parliamentarians, females, are more and very high, which is even a higher threshold than what you will call positive discrimination intends to be. And that is in itself a good thing because it shows political will, and psychologically speaking, it's very inspiring and changing of the mindset for the society. I would also talk about countries like Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, and other developed countries that have removed or exempted the VAT on pads and sanitary towels. It is assumed that the kind of policies do keep girls in schools. Now we will have to evaluate, of course, and see if really it made an immediate change, but those are the kind of policies that top of mind I would mention to say that, yeah, they are very good and could potentially help women in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just before we go on to a couple more questions for Bilquis and Juliet, I just wanted to invite everyone to join the Tax and Gender working group email list if you're interested, and also to invite you to share on social media the Global Days of Action campaign in making tax work for women's rights. And I think this is especially important right now. We are not able to come together in a physical space and really learn from each other. So I think it's important to sound our voices online. And of course, we will share all the presentations afterwards and some of the information that's been requested following the speakers. The next question is from Chantal for Juliet from FOWODE. How do you link national gender responsive budgeting advocacy with macro level policies of the World Bank IMF and the financialization of public health services in collusion with corporates? So yeah, I guess the question to you, Juliet, how gender responsive advocacy, how have you found in your work since '98? Is there any inhibition from policy space that the government in Uganda has? And has there been any restrictions you feel from international institutions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll do my best to respond to the question. The gender budget work at the local level inevitably links to the national level because I keep hearing an echo, just a minute. Yeah, so it's linked to the national level because what happens is the people at the grassroots level link with the leaders that are closest to them. Say at district level, they'll express their issues to say the district chairpersons, district councillors, and of course there are many other issues that the districts cannot handle. But because the community members pressurize the district level duty bearers, who then also send the pressure upwards, which we found is really important, because if they can't do it, there are certain things that the districts can't do. And maybe one of the reasons why is because we talk of Uganda having decentralized governance, but the reality is that it's actually not very decentralized. It's not, when you come to the practice, I think the governance is very centralized. And so all these issues that are not being handled at that level get pushed up, and sometimes the pressure is exerted by the local leaders because it gets to a point when the communities who and remember that these leaders live within the vicinity, and so the pressure is normally quite high. And I think the other one was around the financialization of health. Was that it?
So, sorry, say that again.
Was the other question around financialization of health services?
Sorry, let me just find it for a second. Bear with me. Yes, the financialization of public health services, so like the privatization of health services. We've seen that in some countries around the world as hand in hand with austerity measures or fiscal consolidation, or however you want to call it. So I guess maybe you can respond to if you've seen that or.
Yeah, okay, so the situation that we have in Uganda is not very different from that in many developing countries. There's a lot of pressure to financialize different sectors, the health sector, education sector, and already we can see that it just doesn't end well. And as a tester or as a starter, we already have had situations like the Mulago Maternal and Neonatal Hospital, where government set up this structure, and I'm just giving this as an example. They renovated the Mulago Hospital to provide specialized care for women and children, but this unit is hardly used because people can't afford it. Even the so-called rich are not able to use it. Then we also have another hospital PPP arrangement that government is planning with a company called Finasi and Rocco. And already there has been, an uproar. We can't already use the services in Mulago. It's demonstrated that people cannot afford these services, and the taxpayers would still have to bear the brunt. And in fact, what the advocacy has been, the doctors are saying, why don't we, boost funding to the local hospitals, the health centers, rather than, these PPP arrangements where the ultimate person to pay the price is going to be the ordinary Ugandan, and the poorest of the poor will suffer, especially women.
Great.
Thank you
so much. Thank you so much. That was a really great answer. So just going to a last question for Bilquis from Chantal. Tax policies in developing countries are closely linked to neoliberal global financial institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, and debt services. What linkages is the tax justice analysis making on this? This question was raised before your presentation, Bilquis, but I thought maybe you want to respond to that.
Okay, thanks. Actually, what we have been struggling with finding research in South Asia on these issues, on fiscal consolidation and all. And there's only some research that has been done in India around that. And that is also years ago. So the link between what I presented and, regressive taxation is very, very clear. And same is, and the fiscal space is also linked with illicit financial flows in Pakistan, because a number of politicians in Pakistan have been proven to be involved in these illicit financial flows. At the global level, there is literally very little support. For example, from Swiss banks, we cannot get the data. because they have their own laws. So it's more a national linked with global, and the government for debt servicing cannot do anything else but to put more tax burden on people. What we are asking for is that it goes into progressive taxation instead of regressive taxation, because progressive taxation would then mean that the rich people are taxed more to provide fiscal space to the state to do the debt servicing, because at the moment in Pakistan, the debt servicing eats up over 20% of our budget, our GDP. So that's a serious situation. And I think in the other, developing countries, the situation may be the same. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We have many more questions, and especially for also sharing information. So I have collected those, and we will find that information and share it with you via email afterwards. If for some reason we're not able to share with you this information and you haven't received an email from us by the start of next week, please get in touch with any one of the email addresses shared in the in the chat box, not the tax box. We're not taxing you for your comments, don't worry. I just want to say thank you again to everyone for joining, for the amazing speakers and sharing about the work that you do. And yeah, it's very exciting to hear all the work that's going on, but also to be able to come together still, maybe only virtually. And we really invite you all to join the Tax and Gender working group email list, but also our monthly calls. And if you have any ideas or suggestions or want to share things that you are working on, then please do share it with us.